Hello everyone, my name is Vishwesha. Welcome to this course on fundamentals in ecology, and the specific module I am going to cover is population dynamics in ecology. So, in this today's lecture I will provide a very brief overview of what are the kind of questions we are interested in population biology, how do we study them, and some empirical examples as motivating these questions. Okay. Population ecology as a field aims to study how populations change over time and space. Not only do we want to study these patterns over space and time, we want to understand, quantify these patterns, and we would like to understand the processes that generate these patterns. With that broad motivation, so the specific points I am going to cover in this video are some terms and examples of population dynamics, and secondly how mathematical modeling plays an extremely important role in understanding patterns and processes, and what is the philosophy of using mathematical modeling in population dynamics. Okay. So, let me begin with a bunch of examples to motivate why we would like to study populations and what is the role of quantitative features in doing so. Okay. So, here is an example of a growth curve, how population of snail kites, they were very low in number and they began rapidly increasing over time. This is an example of a growth. In the study duration, the population kept on increasing, although it remained at low numbers for several years. And here is an example, in fact this example is from one of my colleagues at IISc. What my colleague did was to collect soil microbes and then he studied them in laboratory cultures. And what you find is that starting with some initial population value, which is given here at around 0.15 or so at here, the population increases rapidly in the beginning and then it reaches a maximum value. It sort of saturates, but also slowly decays over time. Okay. This is a sort of if any of you have done microbial growth experiments, this is an example of one such experiment. Here is another example of a decline of population. So, populations not only grow and stabilize and saturate, but they can also decline sometimes, and it is really of crucial importance to understand what processes drive decline of populations, and it has huge implications for conservation of species. And there are some populations that do not change a whole lot, and they stay roughly around the same value over a fairly large period of window. So, once again we need to ask questions such as what stabilizes these populations, and what are the factors that cause some minor fluctuations in their populations over time. Are they demographic fluctuations, are there environmental fluctuations, and so on. So, here is an example, this example is actually from one of my own research work. Here with collaborators from China, we were studying how a grassland ecosystem was recovering over time, and what you see on the y axis is the grass cover in an area which was relatively low in the initial years, sort of slowly increasing, and sort of it shows threshold like dynamics after some number of years. So, it is an example of a recovery of a population over time. And what is the process that sort of aids the recovery of populations is again a question of huge significance in conservation and restoration. And this is a sort of for those of you who sort of follow wildlife studies, you might be familiar with the extinction of northern white rhinos, which went extinct in the last decade or so. Their numbers were decent for some years, but it began rapidly decreasing since 1960s, eventually leading to an extinction. It is not merely a decline, but the entire population eventually went extinct. And this is a classic example of how populations actually do not stabilize, but actually exhibit cycles. So, here is an example of lynx population which rapidly increase followed by rapid decline, and it is not a one time increase or a decrease, but this happens repeatedly periodically. Again the question would be, what causes these population cycles? What are the ecological interactions and processes that maintain these cycles? Okay. So, what we have seen so far are basically a number of examples of population dynamics, and the natural question is what are these patterns, can we quantify these patterns, and then can we explain these patterns in terms of the ecological interactions and processes. It could be a combination of biotic and abiotic processes that lead to these temporal changes in populations. And we would more specifically would like to understand what are the individual level properties, demographic parameters that can help us explain these population level patterns. And not only that, we want to be able to predict populations over time, right. And to be able to predict, we need to have a good understanding of the factors that are currently that can explain the recent or long term trends of the populations. And finally, if we understand single populations, can we now scale to understanding entire communities where many populations and many species interact with one another to produce community dynamics. So, these are the broad goals of the field of population biology, and to understand this there are many concepts we need to learn, and some key concepts that I would briefly take you over today are as follows, and probably very basic that many of you are familiar with. One is, of course, we need to measure population sizes and abundances, which could be in the form of number of individuals or number of population which is actually scaled by certain area or population density, right. In addition to knowing the population numbers, if we really want to understand how these numbers or densities are changing over time, a very useful quantity is that of per capita growth rate. So, what is a per capita growth rate? First let us think of these concepts will be revised in more concrete terms in the upcoming videos. Here I am only giving you a brief introduction. So, what is per capita growth rate? So, think of growth rate first. Growth rate tells you how the entire population numbers are changing. The population, let us say, change from 1000 individuals to 1100 individuals over a duration of time. That means there was an increment of 100 individuals for some amount of time. So, that would determine the population growth rate. The per capita population growth rate actually is the growth rate per individual. Okay. Although individuals do not we can only define one event for an individual, especially the death, whereas there are number of births per individual, but the average quantities are only defined for the populations, but the individual average quantities are very useful quantities for us to understand population dynamics. And the per capita growth rate would be basically per capita birth rate minus the per capita death rate. And next is the concept of density independence. So, if the per capita growth rate does not depend on population density, we call this a density independent population growth. On the other hand, if the per capita growth rate depends on the population density, we call this density dependent population growth. Okay. And to sort of put these concepts and to make quantitative predictions as well as conceptual advances in in understanding population dynamics, mathematical models play an extremely crucial role. So, in the next few slides, let me explain how what is the philosophy of modeling population dynamics. Okay. The first one is that of abstraction and simplification. Ecological systems are of course incredibly complex, and they have many interacting species, environmental variables, and the habitats and the environment all play a really important role in determining how populations change over time. So, the idea of modeling populations is to reduce the amount of complexity and to focus on the most essential features. Okay. So, in some sense the modeling philosophy is that simplification is actually necessary to make sense of the complex systems that ecological systems are. And however, there is always it is important to keep in mind that there is a trade off between realism and simplicity. If models are way too simple, they are going to be eventually biologically useless to be explaining any real data patterns. On the other hand, if they are as complex as real systems, then they will not really help us understand real systems either. So, a model should be simple enough for it to be realistic, understandable and tractable, but it should not be so simple that it loses the biological meaning and the power of explaining the patterns. And the mathematical modeling really helps us in quantification and precision. And the reason is that the moment we begin to express our concepts in mathematical terms, we ought to be very precise and we have to be quantitative. And this really helps us avoid ambiguities in what we mean. For example, two ecologists might say there is a negative density dependence. How, but is the density dependence linearly declining, or is it exponentially declining, or is it some other a nonlinear form, right? Now, only when we begin to, all of them can be captured by the qualitative term that they are all density dependence is a negative function, but it does not really, but by putting them in a mathematical modeling form, we make our statements more precise, and depending on those details, how the population changes over time and space might differ. And this helps us avoid ambiguity and it enables precise predictions. And the next is modeling. This might seem a bit counterintuitive, but modeling is also a form of experimentation. Now, why do we say so? When we think of an ecological process in the form of a mathematical model, we make very precise assumptions and express various relationships, right. For example, how does per capita growth rate decay with density, okay. And then when we analyze these mathematical models, now the analysis, the setting up of the model and the corresponding analysis is somewhat similar to conducting a laboratory experiment under controlled conditions, right. Of course, and the whole idea of doing experiments is that we want to understand how a complex system can be the dynamics of complex systems happens under variables where we have good control over, and mathematical modeling is one extreme form of that, where we mathematically express relationships and we look for the outcomes associated with that. And these predictions can sometimes be very counterintuitive and something we could not have guessed, and they can help us identify precise cause and effect relationships, and it can also help us. For example, if we are using mathematical modeling to explain a certain empirical data, it can also help us tell us, are the observed empirical results very general and robust, or are they very specific to the system being studied. If a very simple model with very few assumptions can explain a given empirical pattern, maybe this empirical pattern will repeatedly occur across many systems. On the other hand, if I have to make very specific assumptions about the very specific system that I am studying to explain an observed pattern, that means maybe the results are not very generalizable. And eventually mathematical models and the mathematical terms also aid us in precise communication of the underlying processes and the subsequent results. And the predictions that these mathematical models provide us actually are a really good tools for even generating the hypothesis and testing. And in the typical ecological or more generally biological contexts, researchers think about underlying processes, concepts, and argue verbally what could be the possible outcomes if my hypothesis was true, what could be the possible outcome if an alternative hypothesis was true, what could be a possible outcome if another hypothesis was true, right. Now, that entire set of argumentation is often carried out verbally. Now, if you translate them to mathematical expressions, each of them can actually provide precise quantitative predictions and which can actually be tested in a real experimental setup. And the experimental results will then help us identify which of these multiple hypotheses are actually correct. So, to summarize this introductory class, the population ecology aims to study how populations change over space and time, and in this video I have briefly described some terms and examples of population dynamics, and also I have conveyed some brief synthesis of the role of mathematical modeling in studying populations. So, in the upcoming lectures, because mathematical modeling is so central to understanding populations, we will have one lecture video on that refreshes the basic mathematics, and in subsequent lectures we will cover density independent population growth, some numerical examples of how we use these modeling tools, and then density dependent population growth. Okay. They may not there may be some slight reordering, but these are the main topics that we will be covering in the subsequent lectures. Thank you very much. I hope I will enjoy the process of learning population modeling in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.